We're back, and I'm very pleased to say we're joined by a colleague of mine from the Center for Security Policy, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps Reserves by the name of Tommy Waller. He is in charge of the infrastructure work we do at the Center for Security Policy, trying to secure it, notably through the work of a wonderful coalition that Tommy manages called the Secure the Grid Coalition. Lieutenant Colonel, it's good to have you back with us. Welcome once again to Securing America.
Thank you, Frank, for having me.
Well, thanks for all you do to secure America. And let's talk a little bit about a phenomenon that happens periodically that could have, well, profound effects. I think it's fair to say for our security, in fact, for our very existence as a nation. It's something called space weather, and there's been a little bit of it going around lately. Talk about it, if you would.
Sure, Frank. Yet the news headlines last Monday disclosed that there were radio blackouts over parts of Asia and parts of Australia. Those radio blackouts were caused by what you just mentioned, solar weather. In this case, it was what's known as an M1 class solar storm. What does that mean to the American public? Well, an M1 class storm is really the smallest, the least severe, and yet it still had the ability to black out radio communications. What we really worry about, Frank, are the more severe solar storms, those that could actually do much more damage than just prevent us from talking on a radio temporarily. In fact, the sun produces coronal mass ejections, these highly charged particles that move out of the sun into space. And if those were to connect with the Earth in such a way that it has in the past, in 1859, in 1921, the results for us, for modern civilization, could be really catastrophic.
Hmm. And Tommy, when you talk about this, this is something that happens actually all the time, but simply because of the size of the sun relative, particularly to the Earth, most of these solar flares are emitting this energy elsewhere. But every once in a while, as you say, they're bore sighted on the Earth. And we got a small taste of what could happen with this M1 phenomenon. What's the likelihood that there will be a more powerful solar storm headed our way in the future? And what would the implications of it be for not just radio signals, but perhaps for our electric grid and society?
Well, Frank, the chances of that are increasing. And part of the reason for that is we're nearing the end of the 11-year solar cycle. So the sun, over a period of 11 years, goes from a position where its magnetic poles actually shift. And so what happens is there's more increases of this solar activity during that polarity shift, right? And we're approaching that right now. In fact, there was a solar storm, a much larger than an M class, just last week as well. It wasn't, as you mentioned, directed towards Earth. So why does that matter to the United States or to the rest of the world? It's because those coronal mass ejections, those highly charged particles, when they interact with the Earth's magnetosphere and the crust of the Earth, it can generate massive amounts of electromagnetic energy. And that energy travels through the Earth's crust. And just like electricity in any other, facet of life, it always seeks the path of least resistance.
Hmm.
And sometimes that path of least resistance are the long electric transmission lines that we have that transport electricity across this
You
country.
know, really the
And so if
backbone of
those
our
lines
electric
were to
grid.
have an induction of current, it could be catastrophic.
Yeah, it would fry, in other words, the grid, the transformers and SCADA systems and the rest. And if we had that happen, Tommy, it's a grid down kind of problem, and putting it back together again would be both protracted and hugely costly if, in fact, there's a nation there to really do that kind of work, isn't it?
That's right, Frank. Exactly. What happens is those currents, as you mentioned, can travel into these huge transformers, which are really irreplaceable, and they can do catastrophic harm. We've seen it in 1989 in Quebec. The internals of these transformers melt
Hmm.
in such a way that you just can't repair it. It has to be replaced, and they're very difficult to make and almost exclusively made in other countries. It's a situation, Frank, where we absolutely have to protect the grid against these storms. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, right now, the industry, the standard that's been set for the industry is number one, far too low and not nearly as urgent as it should be. That standard, the TPL 007 4, is not supposed to be completely implemented until 2028, if you can believe that.
Wow. Well, and the code and the various you know intricacies of all of this are probably going to be lost on most of us. But I think the bottom line is clear: we cannot afford to remain unprotected against this particular threat, existential threat to our grid, let alone the various other kinds, the physical sabotage, the cyber warfare, or something that is kind of the equivalent of what you've just described on the man-made side, electromagnetic pulse attacks. And every one of our adversaries knows about our vulnerability in this regard and is, I think, quite prepared doctrinally as well as physically to execute attacks that would take advantage of those vulnerabilities. Tommy, one of the things that I know the Secure the Grid Coalition has been doing great work on with your leadership is protecting from budget cuts or other ill-advised decisions at the policy level, the scientists who are doing the critical work, understanding, monitoring, and warning about these kinds of space weather threats. Talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Sure, absolutely. A lot of times, Frank, are the staffers in Congress or the congressional members themselves who control the purse strings. They don't always understand the gravity of some of these programs. They might think, well, it's just a space weather research. So what do we really care about space when we have all these other programs, right? Well, our Department of Interior has a phenomenal program, the U.S. Geological Survey (USGS), that both tracks what's happening in space, this solar weather we just spoke about, but also a lot of its effects on Earth. And
Mm.
so there's these geomagnetic observatories throughout the world that track this data. There's satellites, and there's a whole mapping program where we have academia, scientists out there helping us figure out the specifics of the effect of solar weather on the Earth's crust and then how that would affect our critical infrastructure. Why does that matter? Once we have that science and those facts, it's much, much harder for industries that want to avoid having to do this work and avoid making those investments to protect their infrastructure. It's a lot harder for them to say no.
Right.
And so it's important, and that's why our Secure the Grid Coalition has consistently supported the USGS geomagnetism program, and just last week provided some testimony to appropriators to do so.
Well, bless you for doing that, Tommy. Two other things that I want to hit quickly before we let you go. The federal government has not been terribly constructive, as that the last discussion suggests, when it comes to taking steps needed to protect the grid. Some efforts have been made at the state level. Talk about Colorado and Texas, Tommy, and also, if you would quickly, just two films that are now coming out in the next few weeks, in fact, about the grid vulnerability and why we need to take steps, practical steps that are available to us to remedy it.
Sure. Yeah, Frank. We've been working this at the state level for years, as you know, and it's an uphill battle. Recently, there was a bill filed in Colorado, the Colorado Critical Infrastructure Resiliency Initiative, which would seek to protect not just the grid, but water and wastewater, fuel, all the state's critical infrastructures against all hazards, which would include space weather or nuclear EMP. So that's a positive step, seeing that bill filed. Whether it will go anywhere, it remains to be seen. We, of course, will be promoting as much as we can some movement. In Texas, Frank, as you know, Senator Bob Hall has sponsored legislation that would take care of this problem. That unfortunately, every session seems to fail, and not on accident. We think this can be changed, Frank, when the public wakes up. And as you mentioned, there's two incredible films coming out now. In fact, this week, right now, your viewers can go to theblackskyevent.com to see a documentary series, the first episode of the Black Sky Event film series. So that is theblackskyevent.com. They can log in, put their email address, and they'll be notified this week when it comes out. May 18th, later this month, another film, Grid Down, Power Up, a documentary that's going to be filmed, that's screened right in Austin, Texas, the epicenter of really the most progressive movement towards grid security that we've seen, again, led by State Senator Bob Hall, a champion for our country in securing the grid against all hazards,
Yeah.
including EMP.
Texas is an obvious place for this kind of work to be done, between the fact that they've had some very bad weather, not space, the old fashioned terrestrial kind last year, which essentially froze literally the electric grid of Texas for a few days and left people for a longer period of time without power. It was a desperate situation. Dang near lost the grid altogether down there. Then
Yes,
there's
sir.
the fact that in addition to having their own grid, they have leadership like that of Senator Bob Hall, and we desperately need to see him succeed. These films, I think, Tommy, will be great catalysts for it. I've had a chance to preview some of both of them, and they are very well done and make the case very compellingly that what we're looking at this point truly is whether the country survives the prospect of various man made threats to our nation, which we know are out there. We know from our enemy's doctrine that they understand that they can neutralize the United States by attacking this most critical of critical infrastructures. And even if that doesn't happen, folks, there is this problem that there will be a solar storm in our future, boresighted on planet Earth, that will put an electromagnetic world of hurt on us, and we can't let that happen. Tommy Waller, thanks for the work you do at the Center for Security Policy. Secure the Grid Coalition has a great website resource, securethegrid.com. Check it out, folks, and also check out these terrific films as they roll out. You're not going to want to miss them. Tommy, come back to us again very soon if you would. Robert Charles joins us next, right after this.